The Buddha was born a Hindu prince, raised in Hindu traditions, and yet created a philosophy that challenged fundamental Hindu beliefs. Some Hindus even consider Buddha an avatar of Vishnu. Two ancient spiritual paths, one embracing the eternal self, the other rejecting it entirely. What if the path to enlightenment requires abandoning our most cherished belief, the idea of our own soul? How did these traditions diverge, and why do millions still debate which path leads to true liberation? Welcome to Buddha's Wisdom. I'm Peter, and today we're exploring the fascinating relationship between Hinduism and Buddhism, two spiritual traditions that shaped the East and now captivate the West. While they share geographical origins and certain practices, their core philosophies reveal dramatically different visions of reality, suffering, and liberation. My own journey with these traditions began 20 years ago when I stumbled into a Hindu temple in southern India, mesmerized by the rituals and devotion. Years later, a 10-day silent Buddhist meditation retreat showed me a completely different approach to spiritual practice. The contrast between these experiences sparked questions I'm still exploring today. I've spent years studying these traditions, and what fascinates me most isn't just their philosophical differences, but how they've shaped the lives of billions across history. Whether you're meditating in a yoga class or practicing mindfulness for stress reduction, you're touching practices from these ancient wisdom traditions. Think of them as spiritual siblings, raised in the same household but taking very different paths in life. One embraces the divine in countless forms, while the other, as we discussed in a previous video, questions whether gods matter at all. One celebrates the eternal soul, while the other considers this our greatest delusion. The Dhammapada, one of Buddhism's most revered texts, states, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought. It is founded on our thoughts. It is made up of our thoughts." Meanwhile, the Hindu Bhagavad Gita teaches, "The soul is neither born, nor does it die. It is not slain when the body is slain." These contrasting views reflect the fascinating tension between these traditions that continue to guide billions of people worldwide. Together, we'll uncover the surprising connections and profound differences between these traditions. Whether you're new to Eastern philosophy or have practiced meditation for years, this exploration will deepen your understanding of both paths and perhaps your own spiritual journey. Let's start at the beginning, not just the beginning of Buddhism, but the vibrant world that shaped it. Picture northern India 2,500 years ago. Bustling trade routes connecting diverse kingdoms, forests filled with spiritual seekers, and marketplaces echoing with philosophical debates. Hinduism, though it wasn't called that yet, had already existed for thousands of years. The ancient Vedic traditions featured elaborate rituals, a complex pantheon of gods, and a rigid social structure. This was the world Siddhartha Gautama was born into. You might remember how this sheltered prince of the Shakya clan left his palace in what is now Nepal, abandoning luxury to seek deeper truths. He was raised as a Hindu, educated in Hindu scriptures, and expected to follow Hindu customs. The religious texts he studied, the Vedas and Upanishads, shaped his understanding of the world. The Upanishads were particularly significant. These philosophical texts questioned the ritualistic aspects of Vedic religion and explored profound concepts like Brahman, the ultimate reality, and Atman, the eternal self. One famous passage from the Chandogya Upanishad declares, "Tat Tvam Asi," you are that, meaning your true self is one with the ultimate reality. Despite his privileged upbringing, or perhaps because of it, Siddhartha began questioning these traditions. After witnessing sickness, old age, and death beyond his palace walls, he abandoned his royal life to seek answers to suffering. What's fascinating is that Buddha didn't set out to create a new religion. He was simply a Hindu seeker following established practices of his time. He studied with prominent Hindu teachers, mastered meditation techniques, and practiced extreme asceticism, starving himself nearly to death in pursuit of enlightenment. When these approaches failed him, he developed a middle way between indulgence and asceticism. Sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, he attained enlightenment and began sharing his insights. Buddha's teachings weren't a complete rejection of Hinduism, but rather a reform movement within it. He accepted many Hindu concepts like karma, rebirth, and the goal of liberation from suffering. But he radically reinterpreted others. He rejected the authority of the Vedas, questioned the caste system, and denied the existence of an eternal soul. For many Hindus, these were revolutionary, even heretical ideas. This rejection of caste hierarchy planted seeds for social reform that would flower centuries later. While Orthodox Hinduism maintained the Varna system, movements within Hinduism eventually challenged rigid caste divisions too. The medieval Bhakti movement saw Hindu saints like Mirabai and Kabir declare that devotion transcended birth status. Today, both traditions continue wrestling with equality and inclusion, though from different starting points. Buddhism's foundational challenge to social hierarchy versus Hinduism's gradual reform from within. As the Buddhist scholar Richard Gumbrich puts it, the Buddha was a radical critic of Brahminical religion, but worked with its concepts, doing what we might call judo with ideas, rather than wrestling with them. This context helps explain why Buddhism eventually faded in India while flourishing elsewhere. Imagine walking through ancient Nalanda University in the 5th century, where Hindu and Buddhist scholars debated in packed halls. One tradition survived in its homeland, adapting and evolving, while the other spread its influence across Asia, transforming cultures from Sri Lanka to Japan. As we'll discover throughout this video, Hinduism proved remarkably adaptable, even incorporating aspects of Buddhist thought while reasserting traditional beliefs. The relationship between these traditions remains complex to this day, with some Hindus claiming Buddha as their own, while maintaining fundamentally different views about the nature of reality and the path to spiritual freedom. Now that we understand their shared beginnings, let's explore the most profound philosophical divide between them, the question of whether we have an eternal soul. At the heart of Hindu philosophy lies a profound concept, Atman, the eternal, unchanging self or soul. This isn't just another teaching. For Hindus, it represents the fundamental truth of existence. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of Hinduism's oldest texts, declares, "This self is indeed Brahman." This short but powerful statement encapsulates a central Hindu belief that our true self, Atman, is identical with the ultimate cosmic reality, Brahman. For Hindus, recognizing this truth, that your innermost essence is divine and eternal, leads to spiritual liberation. Your body may die, but your soul continues its journey through many lifetimes until it realizes its divine nature and merges with the cosmic whole. Now, the Buddha took this foundational concept and did something radical. He didn't just modify it, he completely rejected it. The concept of emptiness lies at Buddhism's core, the radical idea that reality lacks inherent, independent existence. This principle extends to our sense of self. The Buddha taught anatta, no self, declaring that what we experience as a permanent I is actually an illusion. The Buddha said in the Samyutta Nikaya, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness are not self. If they were self, they would not lead to affliction, and it would be possible to control them, saying, "Let these be thus, let these not be thus." But since they are not self, they lead to affliction, and it isn't possible to control them. So what are we according to Buddhism if not an eternal soul, we're a temporary collection of 5 aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, all constantly changing, arising, and dissolving like waves on water. This creates Buddhism's famous rebirth paradox. How can rebirth occur without something being reborn? The Buddha offered a practical answer. What continues is not a soul, but causal connections. Imagine lighting one candle from another. The flame continues, but no unchanging essence transfers between them. It's simply cause and effect flowing from moment to moment, life to life. One moment conditions the next, one life influences the next, without requiring a permanent self to bridge them. Like a river that maintains continuity while constantly changing, our consciousness streams onward, shaped by our actions but never fixed as a permanent entity. This difference isn't just academic. It completely transforms how each tradition approaches spiritual practice. If you follow Hindu teachings, your goal is to realize your true nature, to understand that beneath your changing thoughts and feelings exists an eternal, divine essence. Meditation and yoga serve to peel away the layers obscuring this self-knowledge. But if you practice Buddhism, you meditate to see through the illusion of a permanent self, to recognize that what you call I is actually a process, not a thing. There's no unchanging core to discover, only the liberating recognition that the self you've been defending, promoting, and worrying about doesn't actually exist in the way you thought. The implications are enormous. Consider how we respond to insults. If someone criticizes you, a Hindu perspective might suggest, they're not criticizing my true self, only my temporary physical or mental attribute. Meanwhile, a Buddhist view might be, who exactly is being insulted here? There's no permanent me to be offended, just temporary thoughts and feelings arising in response to words. Both approaches can reduce suffering, but through completely different understandings of reality. Consider how differently followers might approach grief. When a loved one dies, a Hindu might find comfort knowing their eternal soul continues its journey. A Buddhist might focus on accepting impermanence as the nature of all things. Same human experience, completely different frameworks for processing it. This philosophical divide created practical differences too. Hinduism developed elaborate rituals to purify and protect the soul in its journey. Buddhism, seeing no soul to protect, focused instead on practices to see through the illusion of permanence. Interestingly, both traditions eventually developed similar meditation techniques, despite their different philosophies. A Hindu might meditate to discover the Atman within, while a Buddhist might use almost identical practices to confirm no Atman exists at all. This tension between self and no-self appears in how each tradition views enlightenment. For Hindus, moksha means the liberation of the individual soul and its reunion with Brahman. For Buddhists, nirvana involves extinguishing the very illusion of a separate self. Is one view right and one wrong? That's not for me to say. But understanding this fundamental difference helps explain why. Despite their common origins and similar practices, these traditions developed such distinct approaches to spiritual life. And while this philosophical divide might seem abstract, it leads directly to different understandings of gods, worship, and the role of devotion in spiritual life, which brings us to our next chapter. Enter a Hindu temple, and you might encounter hundreds of deities, colorful multi-armed figures representing different aspects of the divine. Krishna playing his flute, Ganesha with his elephant head, Kali with her necklace of skulls. This rich pantheon reflects a core Hindu belief that the ultimate reality, Brahman, manifests in countless forms. As the Rig Veda, Hinduism's oldest text, states, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, truth is one, the wise call it by many names. For Hindus, these deities aren't separate gods but various expressions of a single divine reality, like how white light splits into many colors through a prism. Now, walk into a traditional Buddhist temple and you'll find a very different scene. In early Buddhism, you wouldn't see gods at all, just images of the Buddha and symbols like the Dharma wheel. Why? Because the Buddha considered questions about deities largely irrelevant to ending suffering. When asked about the existence of gods, the Buddha often remained silent or redirected the conversation. One famous text, the Tevijja Sutta, shows the Buddha responding to questions about reaching union with Brahma, a creator god, by saying, "None of the Brahmins has seen Brahma face to face, so their teaching is baseless." The Buddha didn't explicitly deny gods existed. He acknowledged various devas or divine beings, but considered them temporary residents of higher realms, still caught in the cycle of rebirth, still subject to suffering, still lacking true wisdom. Unlike the omnipotent creator god of other traditions, Buddhist devas are more like longer-lived, more powerful versions of humans. This difference affects how followers approach spiritual practice. Hinduism embraces bhakti, devotional worship, as a primary path to liberation. By loving and surrendering to a chosen deity, Ishtadevata, devotees can transcend ego and realize their unity with the divine. Buddhism, meanwhile, emphasizes personal effort and insight. The Buddha said in his final teaching, "Be a lamp unto yourselves. Be your own refuge. Hold fast to the truth as a lamp. Hold fast as a refuge to the truth." This difference extends to ritual practice itself. Hinduism preserved elaborate ceremonies requiring precise execution, fire offerings, mantra recitation, and life cycle sacraments performed by trained priests. Early Buddhism, by contrast, streamlined ritual elements focusing on ethical conduct and meditation rather than complex ceremonies. The Buddha often critiqued empty ritualism without understanding. When a Brahmin described elaborate fire rituals, the Buddha responded that the true sacred fire was the disciplined mind, and true offerings were virtuous actions. This practical approach made Buddhism accessible beyond priestly circles, though later Buddhist traditions would develop their own ritual complexities. This doesn't mean Buddhists never pray or engage in devotional practices. As Buddhism spread across Asia, it incorporated local deities and developed devotional elements. In Pure Land Buddhism, for instance, devotees call upon Amitabha Buddha for rebirth in his paradise. And in Tibetan Buddhism, deities serve as meditation focal points, embodiments of qualities practitioners seek to develop. Even the Buddha's status evolved, though he never claimed to be divine and explicitly identified as a human teacher. Many Buddhists came to revere him as something beyond ordinary humanity. This parallels how certain Hindu traditions view great sages and teachers. In Mahayana Buddhism, the concept of Buddhahood expanded to include multiple Buddhas across time and space. Remember our video, Who is Maitreya? This tradition of future Buddhas creates an interesting parallel with Hindu avatars, divine beings who manifest in different forms throughout cosmic cycles. Some Hindu traditions even incorporated the Buddha himself as the 9th avatar of Vishnu, as we discussed in our video. This creative theological move effectively claimed Buddhism as a subset of Hinduism, though with the ironic twist that this avatar supposedly taught false doctrines to test the faithful or mislead demons. During medieval India, an extraordinary convergence occurred. Both traditions developed tantric practices with striking similarities, despite their different philosophical foundations. Both traditions used visualization of deities as a spiritual technique, though with different ultimate goals. So while Hinduism might be described as polytheistic, monotheistic, or even henotheistic depending on the tradition, and Buddhism might range from non-theistic to practically polytheistic, these labels oversimplify complex approaches to divinity. What matters most isn't just whether gods exist, but how concepts of the divine shape our understanding of suffering and liberation, which brings us to the heart of both traditions and our next chapter. Life hurts. This simple truth forms the foundation of both Hindu and Buddhist thought. We all experience physical pain, heartbreak, loss, and eventually death. But why must we suffer? And can we ever truly overcome it? Both traditions address these questions, but with different diagnoses and prescriptions. Let's start with their shared concepts before exploring their distinct approaches. Both Hinduism and Buddhism recognize the cycle of rebirth, samsara, where beings move through repeated lives according to their karma. As we explained in our video, Samsara Explained. This isn't a single life followed by heaven or hell, but an ongoing process spanning countless existences. The Hindu text Bhagavad Gita describes it. Just as a person casts off worn-out garments and puts on others that are new, even so does the embodied soul cast off worn-out bodies and take on others that are new. Similarly, both traditions view karma as the moral law of cause and effect. Actions create consequences that shape future experiences, either in this life or beyond. Karma isn't punishment or reward from a deity, but an impersonal cosmic principle. Like gravity, it simply works. But despite these similarities, the traditions diverge in how they understand suffering's root causes and ultimate solutions. For Hinduism, suffering stems from ignorance, avidya, of our true nature as eternal Atman. We identify with our temporary bodies and minds, rather than recognizing our divine essence. This misidentification causes attachment, which leads to suffering when impermanent things inevitably change. The Hindu solution is moksha, liberation achieved by realizing your identity with Brahman. This can happen through multiple paths: Jnana Yoga, knowledge; Bhakti Yoga, devotion; Karma Yoga, selfless action; or Raja Yoga, meditation. The Upanishads declare, "The knower of Brahman becomes Brahman." Buddhism, as covered in our video about the Four Noble Truths, frames suffering through the Four Noble Truths. First, life contains suffering, dukkha. Second, suffering stems from craving and attachment. Third, suffering can end by eliminating its causes. Fourth, the Eightfold Path leads to suffering cessation. The Buddha taught in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, this is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering. Aging is suffering. Illness is suffering. Death is suffering. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. Notice the key difference. While Hinduism sees suffering as resulting from not knowing our true self, Buddhism considers the very belief in a permanent self as the problem. We suffer because we cling to a self that doesn't exist in the way we think. These divergent perspectives create distinct meditative approaches. Hindu yogis often direct attention inward to discover the silent witness behind thoughts, the unchanging I am presence. Buddhist practitioners train to observe all experiences as flowing processes, noting how sensations, emotions, and thoughts continuously emerge, change, and dissolve without a permanent center. Even their ultimate goals differ subtly. Hindu moksha typically means liberation from rebirth, with the soul reuniting with Brahman. Buddhist nirvana also ends rebirth, but without a soul merging with anything. It's simply the extinction of the causes of suffering. The Buddha described nirvana by what it's not. There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. If there were not that unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, there would not be the case that escape from the born, become, made, fabricated would be discerned. Both traditions develop sophisticated meditation techniques for achieving these goals. Hinduism gave us yoga, not just physical postures, but a comprehensive system for stilling the mind. Buddhism contributed mindfulness and vipassana practices now popular worldwide. What's remarkable is how these distinct philosophies often led to similar ethical teachings. Both emphasize nonviolence, ahimsa, truthfulness, non-stealing, and compassion for all beings. The Buddhist metta, loving-kindness meditation, parallels Hindu practices of universal love. So while their metaphysical frameworks differ, both traditions offer practical methods for reducing suffering and cultivating greater awareness and compassion, approaches that continue to influence millions of lives today. Both Hinduism and Buddhism began in the same region, but their journeys since then reveal a fascinating contrast. Buddhism largely vanished from its birthplace by the 12th century, while spreading across Asia. Hinduism remained rooted in India until global migration carried it worldwide. Today, these ancient traditions face modern challenges and influence contemporary culture in surprising ways. Buddhism entered Western awareness in the 19th century, first through scholarly translations, then as a philosophical alternative to Christianity. By the 1950s, writers like Alan Watts and Jack Kerouac popularized Zen Buddhism among counterculture circles. The Dalai Lama's exile from Tibet in 1959 brought Tibetan Buddhism global attention. And by the 21st century, mindfulness meditation, stripped of religious elements, had entered mainstream healthcare, education, and corporate settings. Hinduism's Western journey followed a different path. Swami Vivekananda introduced Hindu philosophy at the 1893 World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. Later, yoga, originally one branch of Hindu spiritual practice, transformed into a global fitness phenomenon. The Beatles' interest in transcendental meditation in the 1960s sparked wider curiosity about Hindu meditation techniques. But these traditions didn't just spread, they transformed. Western Buddhism often emphasizes meditation and psychology, while downplaying rebirth and cosmology. Western yoga frequently focuses on physical postures with little reference to its spiritual roots. These adaptations have created misunderstandings. Many Westerners practice mindfulness without realizing its Buddhist origins, or attend yoga classes without knowing they're performing postures developed for spiritual awakening. Meanwhile, both traditions continue evolving in their Asian heartlands. In Thailand, socially engaged Buddhism addresses contemporary issues like environmentalism and economic inequality. In India, Hindu traditions respond to modernization while maintaining ancient practices. Perhaps most interesting is how these traditions have begun to influence each other again. Some modern Hindu teachers incorporate Buddhist mindfulness practices alongside traditional devotions. Buddhist centers occasionally offer yoga classes that connect postures to meditation, and Western spiritual seekers often blend elements from both traditions, attending Vipassana retreats one month and Hindu kirtan the next. Is this cultural appropriation or the natural evolution of spiritual traditions? There's no simple answer. Both religions have historically absorbed influences from cultures they encountered. Academic scholar of religion Thomas Tweed suggests religions are not static entities but cultural flows that constantly cross boundaries. Perhaps what we're seeing is simply the latest chapter in a conversation between these traditions that began with the Buddha himself. What's certain is that both Hinduism and Buddhism offer profound insights for our modern world. Techniques for managing stress, philosophical frameworks for understanding impermanence, ethical systems that extend compassion beyond human boundaries to include all life. As we discussed in What If Buddha Was a Hindu God All Along? The relationship between these traditions remains complex. Some Hindus still view Buddhism as a reformed branch of their own tradition. Most Buddhists maintain their distinct identity while acknowledging their Hindu roots. But beyond theological debates, Both traditions address our universal human need to understand suffering and find greater peace and meaning. Whether through devotion to divine forms or mindful awareness of present experience, both offer paths to greater wisdom and compassion. The Dalai Lama often states, "My religion is kindness." This sentiment, simple yet profound, perhaps captures what's most valuable in both traditions, regardless of their metaphysical differences. After exploring these two magnificent spiritual traditions, I keep returning to one fundamental question: what does their relationship reveal about the nature of truth itself? The Buddha and Hindu sages sought the same goal, ultimate truth that liberates from suffering, yet they reached different conclusions. One saw an eternal self identical with cosmic reality. The other saw no permanent self at all. Can both be right? This paradox challenges our binary thinking. Perhaps these traditions offer complementary, rather than contradictory insights, different facets of a reality too vast for any single perspective to capture completely. Consider this thought experiment. What if the Buddha were alive today, encountering modern Hinduism and Buddhism? Would he recognize either as capturing his original intent? Would he see them as different languages describing the same spiritual landscape, or as fundamentally different paths? The ancient Hindu text Rig Veda provides a clue with its famous line, "Truth is one, the wise call it by many names." This suggests that ultimate reality transcends our conceptual frameworks entirely. Perhaps both Buddhism and Hinduism are fingers pointing at the moon. Useful indicators, but not the moon itself. This brings us to what scholars call the two truths doctrine, a concept found in both traditions. There's conventional truth, how things appear, and ultimate truth, how things actually are. Both perspectives are necessary, like how physics needs both Newtonian mechanics for everyday calculations and quantum mechanics for deeper understanding. Hindu texts describe this dual perspective through the concept of Maya. The world is both real and unreal simultaneously. The Katha Upanishad states, "What is here is also there. What is there is also here. Whoever sees difference here goes from death to death." Similarly, the Buddhist Heart Sutra declares, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form," suggesting apparent contradictions resolve at deeper levels of understanding. I've come to believe we're asking the wrong question when debating which tradition is correct. The deeper wisdom might lie not in choosing between self and no self, but in understanding how these concepts shape our moment-to-moment experience of being alive. Modern practitioners often find value in both approaches, using Hindu devotional practices to open the heart and Buddhist mindfulness to see through delusion. Rather than conflicting, these practices can complement each other, creating a more complete spiritual toolkit. What matters most isn't theological purity, but practical results. Do these teachings help us suffer less? Do they make us more compassionate? Do they bring greater clarity and peace? As one ancient story tells us, a group of blind men encountered an elephant. Each touched a different part: tusk, trunk, leg, tail, and declared the elephant to be like a spear, snake, pillar, or rope. Each was partially right based on their limited perspective, yet none grasped the whole elephant. Perhaps Hinduism and Buddhism are touching different aspects of truth. Their differences don't invalidate either, but remind us that reality exceeds our ability to conceptualize it completely. And that might be the most valuable lesson of all. In a world increasingly fragmented by ideological divisions, these ancient traditions remind us that contradictory truths can coexist. Whether you're drawn to the Hindu recognition of your divine nature or the Buddhist insight that all things, including the self, are impermanent processes, both paths lead toward freedom from suffering. If this exploration has opened new perspectives for you, help us continue these philosophical journeys by subscribing to Buddha's wisdom and hitting the notification bell. Which aspects of these traditions speak to your own experience? Have certain practices from either path transformed your understanding? Share your story in the comments below, and let us know what other spiritual dialogues you'd like us to explore in future videos. Until next time, may you find wisdom on whatever path calls to you.